The tiny twins wailed beside their father's rain-soaked grave as the last mourners hurried away, leaving them to die in the growing storm. Apache warrior John Crow Feather felt something ancient awaken in his chest as he descended the muddy hill, his decision already made before his scarred hands reached for the abandoned infants. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Montana Territory, United States, spring of 1885. The rain fell mercilessly on the small cemetery of Willow Creek, transforming the earth into thick mud that swallowed the shoes of the few people present. The grey sky seemed to weep for the man who now descended into the earth in a simple pine coffin. Samuel Porter, a 26-year-old ranch hand, had departed this world as early as his wife Margaret, who had died 6 months earlier while giving birth to twin babies. Reverend Calloway closed the Bible with a tired sigh, his words of comfort diluted by the persistent rain. Those present, a few farmers, the owner of the local store, and 2 women from the church, exchanged uneasy glances, all diverting their attention from the 2 small bundles resting on a damp blanket near the freshly dug grave. "What about the children?" asked Mrs. Miller, adjusting the soaked shawl over her shoulders. "Don't they have anyone?" The Reverend shook his head. "No family. Samuel was an orphan, and Margaret lost her parents in last year's epidemic." A heavy silence hung over the group. No one there had the means or desire to take on 2 babies at once. Hard times, too many mouths to feed in each home. "The orphanage in Helena, perhaps?" began Mr. Dawson, the grocery store owner, but his voice was interrupted by a sharp cry that cut through the damp air. The twins, a boy and a girl with identical faces, eyes as clear as the summer sky, began to cry in unison, as if they finally understood they were truly alone in the world. From the hill that bordered the cemetery, John Crow Feather observed the scene with impassive eyes. His face, marked by deep lines and painted with black and red stripes that descended from his temples to his chin, revealed no emotion. He wore a faded flannel shirt over leather pants, and a necklace of bones and beads hung from his neck, a contrast to the clothes he wore at the ranch, where he worked as a horse tamer. He wasn't there for Samuel Porter, whom he barely knew. He was there because something had called him, a dream the night before, clear as spring water. In the dream, a hawk carried 2 small children away from the storm. The white folks began to disperse, casting pitying looks at the babies, but no one collected them. The rain thickened. One of the women leaned over, adjusted the blankets of the little ones, and muttered a hasty prayer before walking away with quick steps through the mud. John descended the slope with silent movements, drops running down his black hair that fell in 2 braids over his broad shoulders. He was 42 years old, but his body still maintained the strength and agility of the times when he rode with his tribe's warriors. He approached only when the last of those present was already disappearing down the muddy road. The twins cried increasingly weaker, the cold penetrating their thin blankets. John stood before them, motionless as a statue. His eyes, black as obsidian, studied those small, helpless beings. He too had buried children, 2 boys and a girl, taken by scarlet fever 7 winters ago. His wife, Morning Star, could not bear the loss and departed for the spirit world the following year. Since then, John had lived alone in a remote cabin, between 2 worlds that didn't fully accept him. He crouched in the mud, touching the rosy face of the boy with rough fingers. The little one immediately stopped crying, opening curious eyes. The girl continued her lament, weaker now. John felt something awaken in his chest, a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. "Shichei," he murmured in his language, "you are not alone." With sudden decision, John Crow Feather gathered both babies in his strong arms. He adjusted them against his chest, protecting them from the rain with his own body. The little ones fell silent, as if recognizing something familiar in this stranger. Without looking back at Samuel Porter's grave or the path leading to town, John began walking toward the hills, carrying his new destiny. The rain eased to a gentle patter as John Crowfeather made his way through the pine-scented forest, carefully balancing the twins in his arms. The path to his cabin was steep and treacherous, winding through rocky outcroppings and dense underbrush that clung to the hillside like desperate fingers. The twins had fallen into an exhausted sleep, their tiny faces pressed against his chest, their breaths coming in small, synchronized puffs that warmed his skin through the damp fabric of his shirt. He knew what he was doing was dangerous. Taking white children, even abandoned ones, could mean trouble. The Indian wars might have wound down, but distrust ran deep as mountain roots in these parts. The reservation at Flathead was 3 days' ride north, but John had chosen to live apart, keeping to himself on the fringes of the white man's world while honoring the ways of his people in private. His skill with horses had earned him grudging respect at the Harrison Ranch where he worked, though few spoke to him beyond giving orders. The cabin came into view as he crested the final ridge, a simple structure of logs and stone nestled in a small clearing. Smoke still rose from the chimney. He'd banked the fire before leaving at dawn. His horse, a dappled grey mare named Shadow Walker, nickered softly from the lean-to shelter beside the cabin. "Soon," he murmured to the infants as they stirred against him, "soon you will be warm." Inside, the single room was clean but sparse, a narrow bed against one wall, a table with a single chair, shelves stocked with provisions, and a stone fireplace that provided both heat and cooking space. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters, and a colorful woven blanket divided the sleeping area from the rest of the space. John laid the twins on his bed, watching as they squirmed and whimpered. Their clothes were soaked through, their skin cool to the touch. The boy's face scrunched up ready to wail, while the girl blinked up at him with eyes that seemed too knowing for one so young. "What do I feed you?" he asked aloud, his brow furrowing. He had raised children before, but never one so small, so dependent. His own had been past weaning when Morning Star brought them to his fire. He stoked the fire until flames danced high, then stripped the wet clothes from the twins and wrapped them in soft buckskin he used for making moccasins. The material was supple against their delicate skin. The girl grasped his finger when he tucked the covering around her, her grip surprisingly strong. "You fight," he said with a nod of approval. "Good. The world is hard." From a shelf he took down a small clay pot of bear fat mixed with herbs, gently rubbing the mixture on their chilled limbs. His mother had taught him this, to warm the body from the outside when the cold crept too deep. The twins relaxed under his touch, their eyes growing heavy again, but soon hunger would wake them. John Crowfeather stood in the center of his cabin, considering his options. In the corner stood a wooden box where he kept his most precious possessions, a silver-backed mirror that had belonged to Morning Star, an eagle feather blessed by the medicine man of his tribe, a small leather pouch containing the first teeth of his children, and a wooden carving of a wolf he'd made for his eldest son. Now he added 2 more items, a small silver rattle found in the blankets with the twins, and a scrap of paper bearing their names, which he'd discovered tucked into the boy's swaddling. He couldn't read the white man's writing, but he knew it mattered. Names held power. A memory surfaced. Sarah, the cook at the Harrison Ranch, had recently had a baby. Perhaps she would know what these little ones needed. John glanced out the window. The rain had stopped, but darkness approached. He would have to ride quickly. He fashioned a carrier from an old blanket, securing it across his chest. Carefully, he placed both twins inside, their warm bodies pressed together. They stirred, but did not wake. Outside, he saddled Shadow Walker, speaking low and soothing to the mare. "Gentle steps," he instructed as he mounted. "We carry precious cargo." The horse seemed to understand, picking her way down the trail with delicate precision. As they descended toward the valley, the last light of day gilded the wet leaves and turned puddles to mirrors of gold. John Crowfeather's face remained impassive, but inside, something long dormant had begun to stir. Purpose, and with it, fear. Not for himself, but for these small lives now dependent on his hands. The Harrison Ranch lay ahead, its windows already glowing with lamplight against the gathering dusk. John urged Shadow Walker forward, knowing that what he was about to do would forever change the course of 3 lives. The Harrison Ranch sprawled across the valley like a kingdom unto itself. A large, whitewashed main house, flanked by a bunkhouse, stables, and various outbuildings, all encircled by a stout fence that marked the boundary between civilization and wilderness. As John Crowfeather approached the main gate, the twins began to stir against his chest, their hunger no longer willing to be silenced by sleep. Lamplight spilled from the kitchen windows, and the smell of fresh bread wafted through the evening air. John dismounted carefully, one hand steadying the precious bundle against his chest. He'd come here seeking Sarah's advice, but as he tied Shadow Walker to the hitching post, the kitchen door swung open, and Eleanor Harrison herself emerged onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. The rancher's wife was not what most expected. Barely 30, with intelligent eyes and a practical manner that commanded respect from cowboys and ranch hands alike. She had taken over much of the ranch management since her husband Thomas had broken his leg the previous winter, and rumors circulated that she had always been the sharper business mind between them. "John," she called, peering into the darkness. "Is that you?" He stepped forward into the pool of light. "Yes, Mrs. Harrison." Eleanor's eyes widened as she noticed the bundle strapped to his chest, especially when a thin cry emerged from it. "What in heaven's name?" "The Porter twins," John said simply. "From the burial today." Her hand flew to her mouth. "Samuel Porter's babies, but they were supposed to be taken to the orphanage in Helena." She descended the steps quickly, her skirts rustling. "Why do you have them?" "No one took them," he replied, his voice flat. "Everyone left. They were alone." Eleanor's expression shifted from shock to disbelief, then to a flicker of shame on behalf of her community. She reached for the bundle, and John allowed her to peek inside at the 2 tiny faces, now flushed with hunger-fueled distress. "Dear God," she whispered, "they're half-starved. Bring them in, quickly." Inside the warm kitchen, Sarah stood at the stove, stirring a large pot of stew. The young Irish woman nearly dropped her spoon at the sight of John Crowfeather entering with Mrs. Harrison, especially when she realized what he carried. "Saints preserve us," she breathed. "Are those the Porter twins?" "They need milk, Sarah," Eleanor said briskly. "Do we still have some from Daisy's morning milking?" "Yes, ma'am, but they're too little for straight cow's milk," Sarah replied, already moving to a cupboard. "My aunt was a midwife back in County Cork. Said you need to water it down for wee ones. Add a bit of sugar to make it closer to mother's milk." John stood awkwardly in the center of the kitchen, the twins now fully awake and crying in earnest. He had faced charging cavalry and rival warriors without flinching, but these tiny wails pierced him in ways he couldn't defend against. Eleanor took charge, directing Sarah to prepare bottles using rubber nipples from her own baby's supplies. She turned to John, her voice gentler now. "May I hold them while you wait?" He hesitated only briefly before carefully extracting the girl first, then the boy, and placing them in Eleanor's capable arms. She cradled them with practiced ease, making soft shushing sounds. "What will happen to them now?" she asked, looking up at John. His face remained impassive, though his eyes never left the twins. "I will care for them." Eleanor and Sarah exchanged glances. "John," Eleanor began carefully, "these are white children. The authorities won't allow—" "They were abandoned," he interrupted, his voice carrying an unusual edge. "Left to the rain and cold. I found them. They are mine now. The kitchen fell silent except for the twins' cries and the soft bubbling of the pot on the stove. Sarah worked quickly, warming the milk mixture and filling 2 small bottles. "What are their names?" Eleanor finally asked. John reached into his shirt and pulled out the scrap of paper he'd found with the twins. He handed it to Eleanor, who studied it for a moment. "Emma and Ethan Porter," she read aloud, then looked back at the babies in her arms. So young to face such tragedy. When the bottles were ready, Eleanor showed John how to hold each twin properly for feeding. His large, rough hands seemed almost comical, cradling such delicate creatures. But there was nothing awkward in the gentleness of his touch. The twins drank greedily, their tiny hands pressed against the glass. "You'll need supplies," Eleanor said decisively. "Diapers, clothes, more bottles, blankets, and you'll need to know how to care for them properly." She studied John's face. "This won't be easy, you understand. Not just the caring for them, but other difficulties will come." John met her gaze steadily. "I buried my children 7 winters ago. My wife 1 winter after that. These little ones have no one. Now they have me." Something in his quiet certainty seemed to reach Eleanor. She nodded slowly. "I'll help you, John Crowfeather. God knows the rest of this town has already failed these children once. I won't be party to failing them again." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows with the promise of another storm approaching. Inside, in the warmth of the Harrison kitchen, an unlikely alliance was forming around 2 orphaned babies, one that would soon face the test of a community's prejudice and a harsh frontier winter. Dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. John Crowfeather had not slept. The twins, now fed and clean thanks to the supplies Eleanor Harrison had insisted he take, dozed in a makeshift cradle he had fashioned from a wooden crate padded with soft rabbit furs. He had spent the night watching their tiny chests rise and fall, marveling at how completely his life had transformed in the span of a single day. "Ahe-he," he whispered in his native tongue, a prayer of gratitude to the spirits for guiding him to the cemetery, for placing these children in his path. The girl, Emma, stirred first, her small face scrunching before her eyes opened. John lifted her carefully, supporting her head as Eleanor had shown him. Her gaze fixed on his face with an intensity that seemed impossible for one so young. "You see me," he said softly. "You see who I am, not what others say I am." He changed her diaper, his large fingers moving with surprising dexterity. Years of crafting intricate beadwork and fashioning delicate snares had prepared him for such precise tasks. As he wrapped her in a clean blanket, Ethan began to fuss, and soon John found himself navigating the challenge of tending to 2 hungry infants simultaneously. By mid-morning, he had established a rudimentary system. He propped bottles using rolled blankets, allowing him to feed both twins at once. He spoke to them constantly, sometimes in English, often in Apache, telling them stories of coyote and raven, of the mountains and stars. They couldn't understand his words, but his deep, steady voice seemed to soothe them. When they finally slept again, John stepped outside to check his horse and gather more firewood. The day was clear, the storm having washed everything clean. He breathed deeply, filling his lungs with pine-scented air, gathering strength for what he knew lay ahead. The path he had chosen would not be an easy one. A movement at the edge of the clearing caught his eye. A deer, a young doe, stood watching him, ears twitching alertly. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither moved. Then the doe bobbed her head once before bounding away into the forest. "A good sign," John murmured. His people believed that animals brought messages from the spirit world. A deer represented gentleness and nurturing, qualities he would need in abundance. Inside the cabin, Emma had awakened and was making small cooing sounds. John lifted her, holding her against his shoulder as he moved around the cabin, showing her the items that filled his simple home. "This is a dream catcher," he told her, pointing to the intricate web of sinew and beads hanging by the window. "It catches bad dreams and only lets the good ones through." He touched the eagle feather dangling from its center. Eagle flies closest to the Creator. His feather brings protection. He continued his tour, naming each object in both English and Apache: the clay cooking pot, the bearskin rug, the bow and quiver of arrows mounted on the wall. Emma watched with wide eyes, occasionally reaching out with tiny fingers as if trying to grasp the colorful world John was introducing her to. When Ethan awoke, John repeated the process, holding the boy against his chest, introducing him to his new home. As the day progressed, John began to notice subtle differences between the twins that went beyond their gender. Emma was quieter, more observant, while Ethan was restless, demanding attention with vigorous cries. "You have strong spirits, both of you," John told them as he changed their diapers yet again. "This is good. The world is not kind to those with weak spirits." Midday brought an unexpected visitor. Eleanor Harrison arrived on horseback, leading a second horse that pulled a small cart loaded with supplies. More bottles, cloth diapers, a wooden tub for bathing the babies, tins of condensed milk, and a strange contraption she called a rocking cradle. "It's from my Thomas's family," she explained as she directed John to carry it inside. "Our Robert has outgrown it, and these little ones will need a proper place to sleep." John accepted her help with quiet dignity. As Eleanor demonstrated how to swaddle the twins more effectively and how to check for diaper rash, he watched and learned with the same focused attention he gave to tracking game or reading weather signs. "The Reverend came by this morning," Eleanor said casually as she showed John how to test the temperature of the milk on his wrist. "Asking after the Porter twins. Said they never arrived at the orphanage." John's face remained impassive, but his body tensed slightly. "I told him I hadn't heard anything about it," she continued. "But John, people will start asking questions soon. Samuel Porter might not have had family, but he was known in these parts. Folks will wonder about his children." "What will they do?" he asked, his voice low. Eleanor sighed, rocking Emma gently as the baby drifted to sleep. "Best case, they'll insist the twins be sent to a proper home, meaning with white folks or at the orphanage." She paused. "Worst case, they'll claim you stole them." "I did not steal what was abandoned," John said, his jaw tightening. "I know that," Eleanor replied softly. "But not everyone thinks like me, and some will use any excuse to—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. As the afternoon sun began its descent behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the clearing, Eleanor prepared to leave. At the door, she turned to John, who stood with Ethan sleeping against his chest. "Be careful, John Crowfeather, and know you're not alone in this. I'll come again in 2 days with more supplies." John nodded, watching as she mounted her horse. "Why do you help us?" he asked suddenly. Eleanor's eyes grew distant. "Before Robert, I lost 3 babies. 2 were stillborn, 1 lived just a day." Her gaze returned to John's face. "Every child deserves to be held with love, John. It doesn't matter what color the hands doing the holding are." After she disappeared down the trail, John stood in the doorway for a long time, the weight of Ethan against his chest both a burden and a blessing. The distant howl of a wolf echoed through the valley, a reminder that wilderness and danger were never far away in this harsh land. The general store in Willow Creek buzzed with activity that Saturday morning. Women exchanged recipes and gossip while selecting yard goods. Men clustered near the potbelly stove, discussing cattle prices and the likelihood of an early winter. Sheriff Malone leaned against the counter, thumbing through a tattered copy of the territorial newspaper, while half listening to Reverend Calloway's concerns. "I'm telling you, it doesn't sit right with me," the Reverend insisted, lowering his voice. "Those Porter twins vanishing like that. Something happened after the burial, I'm certain of it." The sheriff sighed, folding his newspaper. "And you're sure they weren't collected by the orphanage?" "I wrote to Helena myself. They never arrived, never were expected. The arrangements hadn't been finalized." The Reverend's pale eyes narrowed. "And there's talk, Sheriff, concerning talk." At a nearby barrel of dried apples, Mrs. Miller pretended to be selecting the best specimens while straining to hear the men's conversation. Her husband had mentioned seeing John Crow Feather riding toward the Harrison Ranch 2 nights ago, carrying something against his chest. "What kind of talk?" Sheriff Malone asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "That Indian from the Harrison Ranch," the Reverend said barely above a whisper. "The one they call Crow Feather. Abram Jenkins swears he saw him at the cemetery after everyone left. And now Martha Wilson claims she spotted him carrying bundles that looked suspiciously like infants." The sheriff rubbed his mustache thoughtfully. "John Crow Feather keeps to himself, never caused any trouble. Not like some." "Nevertheless," Reverend Calloway pressed, "if he's taken those children, it's kidnapping. They're white children, Sheriff. They belong with their own kind." Mrs. Miller could contain herself no longer. "I heard from Sarah, you know, the Irish girl who cooks for the Harrisons, that Mrs. Harrison herself has been bringing baby things up to that Indian's cabin." Her voice carried across the store, drawing all conversations to a halt. "Bottles? Diapers? A cradle even?" A murmur rippled through the store. The sheriff straightened, his weathered face hardening. "That true, Martha?" Mrs. Wilson nodded eagerly, pleased to be the center of attention. "Saw her with my own eyes, heading up there with a cart full of supplies. And Mike Thomas said he spotted smoke from that Indian's chimney, day and night lately, like someone's up all hours with crying babies." The Reverend turned to Sheriff Malone, his expression grave. "You see, it must be investigated immediately." The sheriff hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "I'll ride up there tomorrow. See what's what." "I should accompany you," the Reverend said quickly, "as a representative of the church. If those children are there, arrangements must be made for their proper care." As the men finalized their plans, no one noticed Thomas Harrison quietly slipping out the door, his purchases abandoned on the counter. Miles away, unaware of the storm brewing in town, John Crow Feather sat cross-legged on the floor of his cabin, the twins lying on a soft blanket before him. 2 weeks had passed since he'd brought them home, and already they seemed changed, their faces fuller, their cries stronger. He studied them with quiet wonder, noting how Emma's fingers curled around a strand of his hair, while Ethan kicked energetically at the air. "Soon you will crawl," he told them. "Then walk, then run. The forest will be your playground, the mountains your school." He spoke in Apache, believing that even if they couldn't understand the words, they would feel their meaning. "I will teach you to track deer, to read the stars, to speak with the wind," Emma gurgled, her face breaking into what appeared to be a smile. John felt his heart constrict. His own children had been older when they came into his life, walking, talking, already formed in many ways. These two were like clay, untouched and full of possibility. "You smile at my promises," he said softly. "Good. A trusting heart is a gift, though one that must be protected." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted his reverie. John rose fluidly, lifting both twins in a single practiced motion. He deposited them in their cradle before moving to the window, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife at his belt. Thomas Harrison's tall figure came into view, riding hard up the trail. The rancher rarely visited John's cabin, preferring to speak with him at the ranch. Something was wrong. John stepped onto the porch as Thomas reined his horse to a stop in a cloud of dust. The rancher's face was grim, his normally easy manner replaced by urgent tension. "They know, John," he said without preamble. "The town knows about the twins. The sheriff and Reverend Calloway are planning to ride up here tomorrow to take them." John's expression didn't change, but something flashed in his dark eyes, a primal, protective fury that made Thomas shift uncomfortably in his saddle. "My Eleanor told me what you've been doing for those little ones," Thomas continued, his voice softening. "Said they're thriving under your care. But John, the law won't see it that way." "No. What law says a child must be left to die?" John asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Thomas sighed, removing his hat to run a hand through his thinning hair. "It's not that simple, and you know it. White children, Indian guardian. This territory's still raw from the wars. Feelings run deep." From inside the cabin came a thin wail. "Ethan, hungry again." John glanced back, then faced Thomas once more. "I will not give them up." "Then you need to leave," Thomas said bluntly. "Take them and go, tonight. Head north to Canada, maybe, or west to the Oregon Territory. And live as a fugitive? Always running?" John shook his head. "That is no life for children." "It's better than being separated from the only parent they know," Thomas argued. "Because that's what will happen, John. They'll take those babies to the orphanage, and you'll be lucky if kidnapping charges are the worst you face." Inside, Ethan's cries grew more insistent, and now Emma joined him. The sound seemed to strengthen John's resolve. "I will not run," he said firmly. "This is my home, and now it is theirs." Thomas studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then you'll need help." He settled his hat back on his head. "I'll send Eleanor up after dark with more supplies. And John, prepare yourself. Tomorrow won't be easy." As Thomas rode away, John returned to the twins, lifting them both against his chest. They quieted immediately, their small bodies molding to his, as if they belonged there. Perhaps they did. Perhaps this was what the spirits had intended all along. "Do not fear," he whispered against their downy heads. "A warrior does not surrender what the Creator has entrusted to him, and you, little ones, were given to me." Outside, the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the clearing. A raven called from a nearby pine, its harsh cry carrying across the valley like a warning. The battle for the Porter twins had begun. The morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that held summer's warmth but whispered winter's coming. John Crowfeather had been awake for hours, having slept little after Thomas Harrison's warning. By first light, he had fed and changed the twins, packed essential supplies, and secured Shadow Walker in the lean-to behind the cabin, ready for whatever might come. Eleanor had arrived after midnight, bringing not only milk and diapers, but also disturbing news. The town council had held an emergency meeting. The territorial judge had been summoned from Helena. Words like kidnapping and Indian menace had been thrown around freely. "They're making it about more than just the twins," she had explained, her face tight with worry as she helped John organize the supplies. "Some see this as a chance to drive you out for good. The Wilsons have had their eye on this parcel of land for years. Now, as the sun climbed higher, John sat in the rocking chair Eleanor had brought on her first visit, holding Emma against his shoulder while Ethan slept in the cradle. He had dressed with particular care that morning, wearing not the ranch clothes the townspeople were accustomed to seeing him in, but clothing that reflected his heritage, a fringed buckskin shirt adorned with porcupine quillwork, leggings, and moccasins. Around his neck hung the bone necklace that had belonged to his father, and a single eagle feather was fastened in his hair, which he'd left loose around his shoulders. He was not trying to provoke, he was simply refusing to hide who he was any longer. If they were coming for the children, they would face not John the ranch hand, but John Crowfeather, Apache warrior, and now father to these orphaned twins. Emma cooed against his neck, her small hand patting his cheek with surprising gentleness. In the 2 weeks since he'd found them, both twins had begun to recognize him, to respond to his voice with what seemed like joy. They had put on weight, their skin glowing with health, their eyes bright and alert. "You are strong," he murmured to Emma, "like the mountain streams that look gentle but can carve through stone." He ran a finger over her downy hair. "Your brother, he is like fire, quick to spark, full of energy. But you, little one, you are water, patient, watchful, finding your way around obstacles rather than burning through them." The distant sound of horses pulled his attention away from the peaceful moment. John rose, placing Emma beside her brother in the cradle. Through the window, he could see a group of riders approaching, Sheriff Malone in the lead, followed by Reverend Calloway and 3 other men, townspeople John recognized but whose names he had never learned. He stepped onto the porch as they arrived, his face impassive though his heart raced. Sheriff Malone dismounted first, his expression grim but not hostile. The Reverend remained on his horse, looking down at John with barely concealed disdain. "Morning, John," the sheriff said, removing his hat. "I reckon you know why we're here." John nodded once. "You come for the Porter children." "That's right." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "There's been some concern about their whereabouts. Reverend Calloway here was supposed to arrange for them to go to the orphanage in Helena. They were abandoned," John said evenly. "Everyone left the cemetery. No one took them. They would have died in the rain." "So you admit you have them?" Reverend Calloway interjected, his thin voice carrying an accusatory edge. John met his gaze without flinching. "I saved them." The Reverend's face flushed. "It was not your place to save them, as you put it. These are white children. They belong with their own kind, being raised in Christian ways." "Their kind," John repeated softly. "They are children. Their kind is anyone who will love them, feed them, protect them." One of the townsmen spat on the ground. "Don't waste time arguing with him, Sheriff. We came to get those babies, so let's get them." Sheriff Malone held up a hand. "Hold on now, Burton. Let's handle this properly." He turned back to John. "Would you allow us to see the children, make sure they're well cared for?" John hesitated, then nodded. "You may see them. You alone," he added, looking directly at the sheriff. The Reverend began to protest, but Sheriff Malone silenced him with a gesture. "That's fair. I'll just take a quick look, make sure everything's in order." John led the sheriff inside, acutely aware of the man's gaze, taking in every detail of his modest home. The neat stack of diapers, the bottles boiling in a pot of water, the cradle where the twins now slept peacefully. The sheriff approached the cradle cautiously, as if expecting to find the babies neglected or harmed. Instead, he saw 2 healthy infants, clean and well-fed, their cheeks pink with sleep. "Well, I'll be," he murmured, genuine surprise in his voice. "They look better than half the babies in town." "Mrs. Harrison has helped me learn what they need," John said, standing protectively beside the cradle. "They are thriving." Sheriff Malone studied him for a long moment. "I don't doubt your intentions are good, John, but you have to understand how this looks. A single man, an Indian man at that, taking 2 white babies. The law has clear views on such matters." "What law says a child must go to strangers when someone who cares for them is willing to be their father?" John asked. "It's complicated," the sheriff sighed. "And it's not really up to me. The territorial judge will be here tomorrow. He'll make the final decision." From outside, Reverend Calloway's impatient voice called, "Sheriff, what's the delay?" Sheriff Malone glanced toward the door, then back at John. "I have to take them, John. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." John's hand moved instinctively to his knife, but he stopped himself. Violence would only ensure he never saw the twins again. "They need milk every 3 hours," he said instead, his voice tight. "Emma does not like to be on her back. She sleeps best on her stomach or side. Ethan chews his fist when he's hungry. They both cry if they are apart too long. The sheriff looked taken aback by this response. He had clearly expected resistance, perhaps even violence. Instead, John was giving him instructions for the twins' care. "I'll make sure whoever watches them knows," he said awkwardly. "And where will you take them?" John asked. "For now, to the Harrison Ranch. Mrs. Harrison has volunteered to care for them until the judge's ruling." Relief flooded through John, though he kept his face carefully neutral. Eleanor would protect them, keep them together, perhaps even bring them back to visit. It was not ideal, but it was better than he had feared. "I will gather their things," he said. As John packed a bundle with diapers, bottles, and the special herbal mixture he used for rash, Sheriff Malone watched him with growing discomfort. "For what it's worth," the sheriff said quietly, "I think you've done right by these little ones. Not many would have taken on such a burden." John paused in his work. "They are not a burden," he said simply. "They are a blessing." When they emerged from the cabin, John carrying both twins and the sheriff following with the bundle of supplies, the Reverend's face darkened with disapproval. "You let him hold them? After what he's done?" "Easy, Reverend," the sheriff warned. "John's cooperating fully, no need for harsh words." As Sheriff Malone took the twins, one in each arm, John felt as if his heart were being torn from his chest. Emma began to cry immediately, her small face reddening. Ethan soon joined her, their distress a physical pain John could barely endure. "They know me," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "They trust me." For a moment, something like doubt crossed Sheriff Malone's face. Then he straightened, hardening himself to the task. "I'm sorry, John, I truly am, but the law is the law." John watched as the sheriff carefully mounted his horse, the twins still crying against his chest. The Reverend looked smugly satisfied, while the other townsmen avoided John's gaze. "The judge will hear your side tomorrow," Sheriff Malone called as they prepared to leave. 10 o'clock at the town hall. "You have the right to speak." John stood motionless as they rode away, the twins' cries growing fainter with distance. Only when they had disappeared from view did he allow himself to move, sinking slowly onto the porch steps, his head bowed. For the first time since the death of his wife, John Crowfeather wept, not in loud, dramatic sobs, but in silent, steady tears that carved paths down his weathered face like raindrops on ancient stone. The cabin behind him, so recently filled with new life and purpose, now echoed with a silence more painful than any wound he had ever endured. Dawn found John Crowfeather kneeling beside the small stream that ran behind his cabin, his body submerged to the waist in the frigid water. Steam rose from his skin as he performed the purification ritual his father had taught him long ago, a preparation for battle, though the battle he faced today would be fought with words rather than weapons. He had not slept. The silence in his cabin was too complete, too painful. Several times during the night, he had risen instinctively at sounds that resembled a baby's cry, only to remember that Emma and Ethan were gone. Their absence was a physical ache, a hollowness that echoed through his chest with each breath. After the ritual, John dressed with deliberate care in the clothes Thomas Harrison had brought him late the previous evening, a clean white shirt, dark trousers, and polished boots. "Dress like them," Thomas had advised, his expression grim. "Don't give them any excuse to dismiss you." John had accepted the clothes, but refused to remove his bone necklace or cut his hair. Some concessions he would not make, even for the twins. Thomas and Eleanor arrived just as the sun cleared the eastern mountains. Eleanor's eyes were red-rimmed from a night of tending to the distraught twins, but her voice was steady as she briefed John. "Judge Carlton is known to be fair but traditional," she explained as they rode toward town. "He puts great stock in proper upbringing and moral character. The Reverend will try to paint you as a savage, incapable of raising Christian children." "Ah, and what of the town?" John asked. Will they all stand against me? Eleanor and Thomas exchanged glances. Not all, Thomas said cautiously. You've been here 15 years, John. Some folks have come to respect you, even if they don't say it out loud. But respect may not be enough, Eleanor added softly. Fear runs deeper than respect in these parts. Willow Creek was unusually busy that morning. Wagons and horses crowded the main street, and clusters of people gathered outside the town hall, a simple two-story building that also housed the sheriff's office and jail. All conversation ceased as John and the Harrisons rode up, followed by a wave of whispers like wind through dry grass. Inside, the town hall had been arranged like a courtroom. Judge Carlton, a portly man with a shock of white hair and penetrating blue eyes, sat behind a table at the front of the room. Sheriff Malone stood nearby, looking uncomfortable in his formal attire. The first 3 rows of seats were already filled with townspeople, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Reverend Calloway occupied a prominent position near the judge, his thin face set in lines of righteous indignation. Beside him sat Mrs. Wilson, clutching a handkerchief and looking suitably distressed for someone who had volunteered to take in the orphan twins out of Christian charity. John noticed with a pang that the twins were nowhere to be seen. "Where are Emma and Ethan?" he asked Eleanor in a low voice. "Sarah is watching them at our house," she whispered back. "I thought it best they not be here for this." Judge Carlton called for order, his gavel striking with a sharp crack that silenced the room. "We are gathered to determine the proper placement of the minor children Emma and Ethan Porter, orphaned on April 17th of this year," he announced in a resonant voice that suggested years of public speaking. "I understand there is some unusual contention regarding their guardianship." Reverend Calloway rose immediately. "Your Honor, the situation is most grave. These innocent Christian children were abducted from their father's graveside by a heathen who has no legal right to them whatsoever." A murmur ran through the crowd. Judge Carlton raised an eyebrow. "Strong allegations, Reverend. Let's hear the facts before passing judgment." He turned to Sheriff Malone. "Sheriff, please state for the record how the children came to be in Mr. Crowfeather's care." Sheriff Malone cleared his throat. "Well, Your Honor, near as I can determine, the twins were left at the cemetery after their father's burial. Weather was turning bad, and it seems no one took responsibility for collecting them. John Crowfeather found them there, abandoned, and took them to his cabin. He's been caring for them for just over 2 weeks now." "Abandoned?" The judge frowned. "Reverend, I was under the impression arrangements had been made for these children." The Reverend shifted uncomfortably. "There was a misunderstanding with the orphanage in Helena, Your Honor. But that doesn't change the fact that an Indian has no business raising white children." Judge Carlton's frown deepened. "I'll thank you to stick to legal arguments, Reverend, not personal prejudices. Mr. Crowfeather," he said, turning to John, "do you wish to speak on your own behalf, or would you prefer counsel?" John stood, conscious of every eye in the room upon him. "I will speak, Your Honor," he said, his deep voice carrying clearly despite its softness. "Very well. But first, I'd like to hear from others who have knowledge of this situation." The judge gestured to Eleanor. "Mrs. Harrison, I understand you've been assisting Mr. Crowfeather with the children. What can you tell me about their care?" Eleanor rose gracefully, her posture reflecting her confidence. "Your Honor, I have never seen children better tended. John has learned quickly how to meet their every need. They are clean, well-fed, and most importantly, loved. They recognize him, respond to his voice. To separate them now would be cruel." Mrs. Wilson scoffed audibly. Reverend Calloway stood again. "Your Honor, while Mrs. Harrison's assessment is touching, it ignores the fundamental issue. How can a man who practices heathen rituals properly instruct these children in Christian values? How can a man who lives in virtual isolation prepare them for society? Before the judge could respond, an unexpected voice spoke from the back of the room. "I reckon I might have something to say about that." All heads turned to see Abram Jenkins, owner of the town's largest cattle operation, making his way forward. Jenkins was a hard man, known for his fair but exacting standards. He had never shown any particular friendliness toward John. "Mr. Jenkins," the judge acknowledged, "you have relevant testimony?" Jenkins nodded, removing his hat. "I do, Your Honor. I've known John Crow Feather for 15 years. He worked my ranch before signing on with Harrison. Never knew a more honest, hard-working man." He paused, his weathered face serious. "My boy Joshua would have died 6 winters back if not for John. Fell through the ice on Miller's Creek. John pulled him out, carried him 3 miles through snow up to his knees to get him home. Stayed up all night, helping my wife tend to him." A surprised murmur rippled through the crowd. This was news to many. "Point is," Jenkins continued, "character ain't about what church you attend or what color your skin is. It's about what you do when it matters. And from what I hear, when those babies needed someone, John was the only one who stepped up." He settled his hat back on his head. "Just thought that ought to be said." As Jenkins returned to his seat, Judge Carlton's expression had grown thoughtful. He turned to John. "Mr. Crow Feather, the floor is yours." John moved to the center of the room, his posture straight but not proud, his eyes meeting the judge's directly. "I am not a man of many words, Your Honor," he began softly. "But for Emma and Ethan I will speak. I will speak of waking in the night to feed them, of learning which songs calm their crying, of watching them grow stronger each day." His voice remained steady, though emotion threaded through it like a current in still water. "I have lost children before, my son, my daughters taken by fever. My wife followed them in her grief. I know the value of family, of love. These twins were given to me by whatever power watches over us all. I did not seek them. I found them when they needed me most." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the townspeople. "You look at me and see an Indian. I look at Emma and Ethan and see children. Not white, not Apache. Just children who need care, protection, love. If that makes me unfit in your eyes, then I accept your judgment. But know this, I will fight for them until my last breath." A heavy silence descended upon the town hall as John Crow Feather finished speaking. His words, though simple, carried a weight that even his harshest critics could not ignore. Judge Carlton studied him intently, fingers steepled before his face, as if trying to peer beyond the exterior to the man within. "Thank you, Mr. Crow Feather," the judge finally said. "Reverend Calloway, do you have any response?" The Reverend rose quickly, his thin lips pressed into a disapproving line. "Your Honor, moving as Mr. Crow Feather's sentiments may be, they change nothing about the fundamental impropriety of this situation. These children have a birthright to be raised among their own people with proper Christian instruction and civilized upbringing." He glanced around the room, seeking allies. "Mr. Jenkins' story is touching, but saving a boy from drowning is hardly qualification for parenthood." Mrs. Wilson nodded vigorously. "Those poor lambs need a proper mother," she interjected, though she hadn't been invited to speak. "A woman's touch, a Christian home." Judge Carlton silenced her with a stern look. "Mrs. Wilson, you'll have your turn." He turned back to the Reverend. "Are you suggesting that Mr. Crow Feather is unfit specifically because of his heritage?" The Reverend hesitated, sensing dangerous territory. "Not exclusively, Your Honor. His isolation, his lack of formal education, his unmarried status, all these factors make him ill-suited to raise these children properly." "I see." The judge's tone was neutral, but something in his eyes suggested he was weighing far more than the Reverend's words. "Sheriff Malone, you observed the children in Mr. Crowfeather's care. What was your impression?" The sheriff cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable being put on the spot. "They seemed well cared for, Your Honor. Healthy, clean." He paused, then added reluctantly, "They cried something fierce when I took them away from him." Judge Carlton nodded thoughtfully. "Mrs. Wilson, you've expressed interest in taking the Porter twins. What makes you and your husband suitable guardians?" Martha Wilson straightened in her chair, arranging her features in an expression of pious concern. "We're God-fearing folk, Your Honor, members of the church in good standing. We raised 4 children of our own, all grown and respectable now. We have a comfortable home, and I've tended many babies over the years as a midwife. And your husband's views on taking in these orphans?" Mrs. Wilson's confidence faltered slightly. "Well, Thomas is a busy man with the sawmill and all, but he trusts my judgment in household matters." The judge turned his attention back to John. "Mr. Crowfeather, how would you provide for these children? Education, social interaction, spiritual guidance?" John met the judge's gaze steadily. "I earn a good wage at the Harrison Ranch. I have savings. For schooling, I would bring them to the town school when they are old enough, or Mrs. Harrison has offered to teach them alongside her son until then." He paused. "As for spirit, I would teach them to respect all living things, to be honest, brave and kind, to honor the earth that feeds them and the sky that shelters them. Is this not what your Bible also teaches?" A murmur rippled through the crowd, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably at the comparison. "And if they wish to learn your Christian ways as they grow, I would not stop them," John added. "Truth is truth, no matter the language it is spoken in." Judge Carlton leaned back, studying John for a long moment before addressing the room. "I've heard enough testimony for now. This court will adjourn for 1 hour while I consider my decision." He stood, gathering his papers. "Sheriff, please ensure everyone remains civil during the recess." As the judge exited through a side door, the room erupted in tense conversation. John found himself surrounded by Eleanor and Thomas Harrison, along with Abram Jenkins, who offered a gruff nod of acknowledgement. "You spoke well," Jenkins said simply. John nodded his thanks, his eyes moving to the door through which the judge had disappeared. "Will it be enough?" Eleanor squeezed his arm gently. "Judge Carlton is fair, John. He'll consider all sides." "But the law," John began. "The law ain't always just," Thomas said quietly. "But Carlton knows the difference between what's legal and what's right. I've seen him rule against popular opinion before." Outside the circle of John's supporters, Reverend Calloway huddled with Mrs. Wilson and several other townspeople, their expressions suggesting they were far from conceding defeat. John could feel their stares, sense their whispered objections. "I wish to see the twins," he said suddenly, turning to Eleanor. "Before the judge returns." She hesitated. "John, they're all the way back at our ranch. There isn't time." "Please," he said, the single word carrying all the longing of a father separated from his children. Eleanor's eyes softened. "If the judge rules in your favor, you can come straight home with us to collect them. They're safe with Sarah, I promise you." The hour passed with excruciating slowness. John sat quietly, declining offers of water or coffee, his thoughts with the 2 small beings who had so completely transformed his life in just 2 weeks. He thought of Emma's solemn gaze, Ethan's energetic kicks, the way they both quieted when he sang to them in his native tongue. Finally, Judge Carlton returned, his face giving no hint of his decision. The room hushed immediately as he took his seat and arranged his papers before him. "This is a most unusual case," he began, his voice measured. "On one hand, we have established customs and societal expectations regarding the upbringing of children. On the other, we have the undeniable fact that when these children were in need, only one person stepped forward to provide care. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on John. Mr. Crow-Feather, the law typically favors placing orphaned children with families of similar background and faith. However, the law also recognizes that the welfare of the child is paramount. These twins were, by all accounts, abandoned after their father's burial. You rescued them, sought proper help in learning to care for them, and have provided them with everything they need. The judge leaned forward. I am particularly struck by the fact that you did not simply hide the children away, but rather sought assistance from respected members of this community. This suggests to me a man who puts the children's needs above his own pride or convenience. Reverend Calloway shifted in his seat, his expression darkening as he sensed which way the wind was blowing. However, the judge continued, and John felt his heart constrict, I cannot ignore the legitimate concerns about a single man raising 2 infants alone, regardless of his heritage. The demands are simply too great, as any widow or widower in this room can attest. Mrs. Wilson smiled triumphantly, already reaching for her handkerchief as if to dab away tears of gratitude. Therefore, Judge Carlton said, his voice firm, my ruling is as follows. John Crow-Feather will be granted conditional guardianship of Emma and Ethan Porter, subject to regular visits from a court-appointed observer to ensure their continued welfare. The collective gasp swept through the room. The Reverend half rose from his seat in protest, while Mrs. Wilson's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Additionally, the judge continued, raising his voice over the growing murmurs, Mr. Crow-Feather must secure appropriate female assistance in the children's care, a condition I believe Mrs. Harrison has already been fulfilling. The children must receive proper medical attention when needed, and when of age, attend either the town school or receive equivalent education. He fixed John with a stern gaze. These conditions are non-negotiable, Mr. Crow-Feather. Do you accept them? John stood, his face revealing nothing of the thundering relief in his chest. I accept, Your Honor. Very well. Judge Carlton brought down his gavel with a decisive crack. This court's decision is final. Sheriff Malone, please arrange for the return of the Porter twins to Mr. Crow-Feather's custody before nightfall. As the judge rose to leave, the room erupted. Some townspeople stormed out, muttering angrily. Others approached John with awkward congratulations or simply curious stares. Reverend Calloway pushed his way toward the exit, his thin frame rigid with indignation. Mrs. Wilson collapsed into theatrical sobs against her neighbor's shoulder. Eleanor grabbed John's hands, her face radiant. You did it, John. You won. But John was already moving toward the door, his stride purposeful. The legal battle was won, but all that mattered now was holding his children again. Thomas hurried after him, calling for their horses to be brought around. Outside, the autumn sun had broken through the morning clouds, casting golden light across the town. John breathed deeply, feeling as though he'd been underwater for the past hour. A few townspeople nodded to him as he passed, not friendly exactly, but acknowledging. Others pointedly looked away. As he mounted Shadow Walker, Abram Jenkins approached, leading his own horse. Gonna be a hard road, the rancher said bluntly. Some folks won't accept this easy. John nodded, understanding the warning. The right path is rarely the easy one. Jenkins studied him for a moment, then extended his hand. John took it, feeling the firm grip of a man who rarely offered such gestures lightly. Those kids could do worse, Jenkins said gruffly. Then he mounted and rode away, leaving John to ponder the strange allies fate had brought him. The ride back to the Harrison Ranch seemed both endless and instantaneous. John's mind raced with plans, improvements needed for the cabin, arrangements for care when he was working, provisions for the coming winter. But beneath these practical concerns ran a current of pure joy that made his heart feel light for the first time in years. As they crested the final hill overlooking the Harrison property, John saw Sarah standing on the porch, a bundle in each arm. The twins, his children. In that moment, as the distance between them shrank with each hoofbeat, John Crowfeather knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them gladly for the two small lives that had become the center of his world. The moment John Crowfeather dismounted in the Harrison ranch yard, time seemed to slow. Sarah stood on the porch, her face breaking into a relieved smile as she descended the steps with practiced ease despite the precious bundles in her arms. Emma and Ethan, wrapped in soft blankets, their faces pink from recent feeding, turned at the sound of approaching horses. "They've been fussy all day," Sarah said, her Irish lilt pronounced with emotion, as if they knew something important was happening. John took a step forward, then another, his movements hesitant yet drawn by an irresistible force. When he stood before Sarah, she carefully transferred Emma into his left arm, then Ethan into his right. The weight of them against his chest released something tight and painful that had coiled inside him since they'd been taken away. Emma's tiny hand immediately reached up, patting his chin as if checking that he was real. Ethan made a small gurgling sound that might have been contentment. John closed his eyes briefly, inhaling the sweet, milky scent of their hair, allowing himself this moment of pure relief. "They remember you," Eleanor said softly, watching the reunion from a few steps away. "Babies know who loves them." Thomas cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the naked emotion on display. "You'd best get them home before dark sets in. I'll have one of the boys bring up a load of firewood later." John nodded, still unable to form words around the swelling in his throat. Home, yes, but home would need to change now, expand, adapt, just as he would. The ride back to his cabin was slow and careful, the twins secure in the carrying sling Eleanor had fashioned, their small bodies warm against John's chest. The afternoon light filtered through autumn leaves, casting dappled shadows across the trail. Birds called from the branches above, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a reminder that wilderness and civilization existed side by side in this rugged country. At the cabin, John was surprised to find smoke already rising from the chimney. As he approached with the twins, the door opened to reveal Abram Jenkins' wife, Clara, her sleeves rolled up and a practical apron tied around her ample waist. "Don't just stand there gawking," she said briskly. "Bring those babies in before they catch a chill." John stepped inside, finding his simple home transformed. A second cradle, smaller than the first but sturdy, had been placed near the fireplace. Fresh curtains hung at the windows, and the smell of stew bubbled from a pot on the stove. "Jenkins women don't sit idle when there's work to be done," Clara explained, noting his confusion. "After Abram rode off this morning, I got to thinking about those twins. Figured you'd need a few things." She gestured to the cradle. "That held all 6 of my grandbabies. It's yours now." John carefully laid the twins in their original cradle, watching as they squirmed and settled against each other. "Thank you," he said, the words inadequate for the gratitude he felt. Clara waved away his thanks. "Judge said you needed female help, didn't he?" "Well, I'm no nursemaid, but I know my way around babies. I'll come 3 mornings a week to start, more if needed." Her matter-of-fact tone brooked no argument. "And I'll be teaching you proper cooking for growing children. That rabbit stew of yours won't do for little ones needing their strength." John felt a smile tug at his lips, the first in days. "I would be honored to learn from you, Mrs. Jenkins." "Clara," she corrected, "we'll be seeing plenty of each other from now on." She paused, her expression softening slightly. "Abram told me how you saved our Joshua. Never properly thanked you for that." "No thanks needed," John said. "Any man would have done the same." Clara shook her head. "But they didn't. You did." She turned back to the stove, effectively ending that line of conversation. "Now, I've left instructions for warming their milk. They should sleep a few hours before needing to be fed again." After Clara left, promising to return the day after next, John sat beside the cradle watching the twins sleep. The events of the past days had left him bone-weary, yet too alert to rest. He found himself mentally cataloguing all the changes needed to make his solitary life suitable for raising children. The cabin would need expansion, perhaps a proper bedroom for when the twins grew older. The lean-to, where Shadow Walker sheltered, would need reinforcement before winter storms. He would have to speak with Thomas about adjusting his work schedule at the ranch. As darkness fell completely, John lit the lamp and placed it on the table. He unfolded the papers Judge Carlton had given him, legal documents declaring him guardian of Emma and Ethan Porter. The formal language meant little to him, but the names inscribed there meant everything. A soft cry from the cradle pulled him from his thoughts. Ethan had awakened, his little face scrunched in hunger. John lifted him gently, leaving Emma still sleeping, and prepared a bottle as Clara had shown him. Settling into the rocking chair with Ethan cradled in the crook of his arm, John began to feed him, humming a low Apache melody. Outside, an owl called into the night. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light across the floor. John looked down at Ethan, whose eyes were fixed on his face as he suckled. "This is home now," he whispered, "for all of us." 3 days later, John was feeding the twins their morning bottles when hoofbeats approached. Tensing instinctively, he placed the babies securely in their cradle before moving to the window. Reverend Calloway sat astride his bay mare, looking distinctly uncomfortable as he surveyed the cabin. The Reverend dismounted stiffly, straightening his black coat before approaching the door. John met him on the porch, expression neutral, but stance protective. "Mr. Crow Feather," the Reverend began formally, "I've come to inspect the welfare of the Porter children, as appointed by Judge Carlton." So, the Reverend himself would be the court-appointed observer. John had expected as much. It was the town's way of maintaining some control over the situation. "They are feeding," John replied. "You may come in, but they must not be disturbed." The Reverend followed John inside, his gaze sweeping critically over every aspect of the cabin before settling on the cradle where Emma and Ethan lay. Despite his obvious desire to find fault, even he could not deny the evidence before him. The twins looked healthy, content, and well cared for. 5 years later, the summer sun hung high over Willow Creek as the town gathered for its annual Independence Day celebration. Bunting in red, white, and blue adorned the storefronts, and long tables laden with food stretched across the town square. Children darted between adults, their laughter rising above the general hubbub of conversation and the occasional firecracker set off by overeager boys. At the edge of the gathering, John Crow Feather stood straight and tall, watching as Emma and Ethan, now sturdy 5-year-olds, played a game of tag with the other children. Emma's dark braids, woven with colorful beads that morning by Clara Jenkins, bounced against her back as she ran. Ethan, his sandy hair cut short for the summer heat, dodged between 2 larger boys with the agility John had carefully cultivated in him. "They grow like weeds," Thomas Harrison remarked, joining John with 2 cups of lemonade. He handed one to John, who accepted with a nod of thanks. "Hard to believe it's been 5 years." John's eyes never left the twins. Time moves differently when you watch children grow. Much had changed in those 5 years. John's cabin had expanded into a proper home, with a bedroom for the twins and a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides. The lean-to had become a barn housing not only Shadow Walker, but also a milk cow, a gift from the Harrisons on the twins' 3rd birthday. A vegetable garden flourished behind the house, tended by Emma's already skilled hands. In town, opinions remained divided about the Apache man raising white children, but the stares had softened over time. The twins' obvious health and happiness, their good manners and quick minds, had silenced many critics. John's dignified persistence, his unfailing politeness in the face of prejudice, had earned grudging respect from even the hardest hearts. Only Reverend Calloway remained openly disapproving, though his monthly inspections had dwindled to perfunctory visits that grew shorter each time. The twins' innocent questions about his pocket watch or his horse often left the Reverend flustered and eager to depart. "Papa!" Emma called, running toward John with a wildflower clutched in her small hand. "Look what I found. Mrs. Jenkins says it's yarrow for medicine." John crouched to examine the flower, his face solemn with the seriousness Emma's discovery deserved. "Good eyes, Shrieked," he said, using the Apache term of endearment that had become second nature. "Yarrow stops bleeding and fights fever." Emma nodded, storing this knowledge away. At 5, she already knew the properties of a dozen healing plants and could identify animal tracks that most grown men would miss. She had inherited her father's quiet watchfulness along with her mother's delicate features, a combination that made her seem older than her years. Ethan appeared beside his sister, slightly out of breath. "Jimmy Wilson says we can't be in the foot race because we don't have a real papa," he reported, his chin jutting out defiantly. "I told him that's stupid." Thomas frowned, but John placed a calming hand on Ethan's shoulder. "What makes a father real, Ethan?" he asked, his voice gentle. The boy thought for a moment. "Someone who teaches you things, who keeps you safe, who loves you even when you break things." He looked up at John with absolute certainty. "You're our real papa." John felt the familiar tightness in his chest, this fierce love that had ambushed him that rainy day at the cemetery and grown stronger with each passing year. "Then you will run in the race," he said simply, "and you will run with honor." Ethan grinned, revealing a missing front tooth before racing back to the gathering children. Emma lingered a moment longer, tucking the yarrow carefully into her pocket before following her brother. "That boy has your stubborn spirit," Thomas remarked with a smile. "And his sister has my caution," John replied. "Together, they are balanced." The annual foot race was a highlight of the celebration, with children grouped by age racing from the church steps to the general store. When the 5- and 6-year-olds were called to line up, John noticed Jimmy Wilson whispering to the other boys, casting glances toward the twins. Reverend Calloway stood at the starting line, his Bible serving as a makeshift starter pistol when slapped shut. He frowned slightly as Emma and Ethan took their places, but said nothing. The years had taught him that open opposition to the twins only made him appear petty in the eyes of the changing town. "On your marks," he called. "Get ready, go!" The children burst forward in a chaotic mass of pumping arms and legs. Ethan quickly pulled ahead, his daily races against Shadow Walker having built his speed and endurance. Emma kept pace in the middle of the pack, her face set in determination. John watched without shouting encouragement, as some parents did. He had taught the twins that one runs for oneself, not for the approval of others. Still, he could not suppress the proud smile that tugged at his lips when Ethan crossed the finish line first, arms raised in triumph. The celebration continued into evening, with lanterns strung between trees and a fiddler playing lively tunes for dancing. John sat with Clara and Abram Jenkins, watching as Eleanor Harrison taught Emma a simple waltz, the girl's face serious with concentration as she counted steps under her breath. "She's going to be a beauty," Clara remarked. "Smart as a whip, too. Been teaching her quilting and she picks it up faster than my own granddaughters." "And that boy," Abram added, nodding toward Ethan, who was arm wrestling with Joshua's son nearby. "Got a natural seat on a horse. Could be a fine cowhand someday." John nodded, accepting their praise with quiet pride. They will choose their own paths when the time comes. I only prepare the ground for their journey. As darkness fell completely, Thomas Harrison called for attention. Before the fireworks begin, I'd like to propose a toast, he announced, raising his cup. To Willow Creek, and all who call it home. The crowd responded enthusiastically, but John noticed Thomas's eyes meeting his across the square. The simple inclusion, all who call it home, acknowledged what many had refused to for years. John lifted his own cup slightly in recognition. Later, with Emma asleep against his shoulder and Ethan drowsily watching the last of the fireworks explode against the night sky, John began the walk home. The trail was familiar now, even in darkness, and Shadow Walker followed behind, carrying a basket of leftover food Clara had insisted they take. Halfway up the hill, Ethan spoke sleepily. "Papa, is it true you found us in the rain?" John glanced down at his son, surprised. "Who told you this?" "Mrs. Miller. She said you took us from the graveyard when nobody wanted us." John measured his words carefully. "Your father, the one who gave you life, died when you were very small. Your mother had already gone to the spirit world when you were born. Yes, I found you at the cemetery, in the rain." "Were you sad?" Emma asked, not as asleep as she had appeared. "No, Shiche. I was not sad. I was—" He searched for the right word. "Complete, as if something missing had been returned to me." Ethan considered this as they approached the cabin, its windows dark but welcoming in the moonlight. "I'm glad you found us, Papa." "And I am glad you found me," John replied, the simple truth of it resonating in the night air. Inside, John settled the twins in their beds, Emma insisting on placing the yarrow flower on her windowsill to dry properly for medicine. Ethan was asleep before John had pulled the blanket over him, his small face relaxed in innocent slumber. John moved to his chair by the fireplace, but did not immediately light the lamp. Instead, he sat in the darkness, listening to the gentle breathing of his children and the familiar sounds of the night outside. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. There would be more suspicious glances from some, more battles for acceptance, more lessons to teach about navigating a world that would not always welcome them. The road ahead would not always be smooth, but tonight, in this moment, the circle was complete. John Crow Feather, once a warrior, now a father, had found his greatest battle and his greatest peace in the same unlikely gift. Two small children who had needed him as much as he had needed them. He reached for the bone necklace that still hung at his throat, fingering the smooth surfaces worn by years of touch. In the Apache tradition, such necklaces connected the wearer to ancestors long past. John had always worn it to remember where he came from. Now, it reminded him of where he was going, forward, with Emma and Ethan lighting the path ahead. Outside, a shooting star blazed briefly across the sky. A good omen, his mother would have said. John watched it disappear, then rose to check on the twins one more time before retiring to his own bed. Emma had shifted in her sleep, one small hand extended as if reaching for something. John gently tucked it back under her blanket. "Dream well, my children," he whispered in Apache. "Tomorrow is another day to be brave." And in that simple cabin on a Montana hillside, where love had bridged the divide between worlds, three hearts beat in perfect harmony under the vast, star-filled sky.